Hello everyone, and welcome to your next lesson within the Dabbling with Watercolor series. This is Ashley James, owner of Pawfully Cute Designs. Hope everyone is feeling a little bit more comfortable with watercolor and they've gotten their materials, because we're going to go ahead and dive into different techniques with watercolor today. As you can see, I've got a couple of different things listed here that we're going to go over today. These are just the basic techniques that I typically use within my watercolor painting. So for today, all you will need is some watercolor paper, you'll need some water, your watercolor paints, and your brush of choice. Today I'm going to be using my lovely silver black velvet number 8 as well as my number 4. Feel free to use whatever you like. We haven't gone over how to hold your brush, which we'll go over in the next lesson or module. But typically speaking, I like to hold my brush at a medium point on my brush. I don't like to hold it too much right here like you're drawing or using a pencil, because that's really good for small detail work, but not necessarily using a lot of movement with a larger piece of paper. The other thing I would recommend is to not use the paper that I'm using today, which is Arches watercolor paper. We talked about that in the last episode, how Arches is more artist grade, but unfortunately I don't have any student grade in stock at the moment, so I'll be using a more expensive paper. Okay. So the first technique that we want to go over is a solid wash. This is really good for when you're creating skies, things of that nature. You're creating some sort of background. So you want to get your brush nice and wet. Okay, think of it, it's a thirsty brush, so it needs water to work. And just select any color that you choose. I'm just going to go ahead and get this little area nice and wet, just to get the surface nice and moist. So I'll just go ahead and pick up a nice red here on my paper, and I'm just going to go back and forth over my paper with my brush very lightly. You don't need to scrub your brush, especially with these. They actually have synthetic hair but also real squirrel hair within the brush, so I don't want to ruin my bristles. So you can just see that just creates a nice lovely little background there. So that's basically what a wash technique would be, just filling up your paper with the paint. You can go ahead and wash out your brush with the water. Okay, and next we're going to do a graded wash. So again, I'm going to get my surface of my paper nice and wet, and then I'm going to choose the color of my choice. So I'm just kind of dabbling in my water first and then going into the paint. So the next color I'll choose is a blue, ultramarine, and I'm going to start from the top to the bottom. So I'm just going to do one horizontal stroke. I'm actually going to go back in and make this a little bit darker. So I went back into my paint. So you can see that's kind of darker. You can make this even darker by going again back into your paint, and you're just going to pull that color down. So what I'm going to do is put my brush into my water, get a little bit off there, and then bring this color down. So I'm just going back and forth and bringing that dark shade down so that you get a dark to light effect. Now I can keep playing with this, going back into my paint, starting at the top and just working my way down, because the surface is already wet. So because of that moisture, it's just going to bring that paint down the more that you continue with your brush strokes. So now you've got that lovely graded wash. It goes from dark to light. Like I said, you can keep playing with this. If you want to make it darker, get more opaque, you can do that. But this is really nice for when you're creating a nice sunset. All right, then our next technique is wet on wet. So basically what you want to do is get, again, your paper nice and wet with some water. Okay. I'm just going to get some of that water off of my brush by placing it on a paper towel. go back into my water and pick up some more paint. I'm going to go ahead and choose, let's say, a green. And I'm just going to drop that paint into the wet section here. And go ahead and wash out my brush and pick up another color. So I'm going to choose yellow. Okay. And then I'm just going to dab that yellow paint that I just picked up into the green. And see how that watercolor, those two colors just kind of go flush together. They just start to blend within each other because they're both wet. So it gives a nice variation there. So I can continue to add more colors. So let's say, for example, I want to add some blue. Dip my brush into the water, go back into my paint, and then just start dropping that color, that blue that I got, into what I've already painted. Now you can kind of see the paint spreading outward, and it's going to continue to do that because of the moisture that's already there. So I'll go ahead and wash out my brush. Okay. So that's just wet on wet technique. You're just using wet paint, water, and mix, kind of letting the water flow so that the paint then flows together. All right, so the next technique is a dry brush, and a lift. So with dry brush, all that really means is you're getting your brush nice and dry. So you're gonna go ahead and swipe that off on your paper towel and go ahead and pick up some paint. I would choose something that you've already got a little bit of water in. So for example, I was using the blue, so I'll go ahead and pick that up. You really don't want your paint to be too wet though. And you can go ahead and start kind of just doing simple brush strokes. So for example, this would be nice for like blades of grass. This is a really nice brush to work with when you are doing dry brush, the Silver Black Velvet series, because it has such a nice point to it that you will get, smaller, skinnier edges at the very end. Now to do a lift, like this shows here, what I would do, just to show you an example, I'm going to take this color here, just going to drop it on the page, pick a little bit more of that up. You can actually lift up color with your brush. So for example, this guy here, I haven't used yet, so he's completely dry. Let's say I made a mistake and I kind of want to lift that up. There's a couple different ways to do that. We'll go and talk about that in the wipeout section, but using your dry brush, you can actually lift up some of that paint as well. So you just kind of skim across the page with your dry brush and just keep going at it and see how that color is lifting off there. Now you get kind of a lighter effect. I'm not going on this side, as you can see, it's still darker. Just keep lifting and lifting. I can actually get my brush a little bit wet now and get that surface wet and go back in with my dry brush to continue lifting up the color. So if you made something too dark and you're not happy with it, that's a really nice technique to use to get the color up. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is called pushing color. So let's say you want to take it from dark to light like we just did here with the dry brush lift. There's another option for doing that as well. So for example, let's say I'm creating some sort of tree trunk. I'm going to pick up some brown here. Okay, so I'm just getting my brush, I got my brush wet. I'm picking up some paint. I don't really want it to be translucent, so the more water that you add, the more translucent your paint is going to come out. So if you want more of an opaque effect, you're going to use less water. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get that opaque look. So I'm going to go ahead and make my tree trunk. So So this is probably going to be a really sad tree trunk, but just again, picking up more color, that opaque. So now I can get more water in my brush and I can start pushing this out, just making little movements to the side. So you can see that how the dark is going to light now because I'm pushing that color outward. I can keep doing that. I can again go back in and pick up more color just along the edge here. And then pull that out with some more water. So you're using the water as your means for pushing the color outward. Okay. The next technique is called negative painting. So I've talked about this before in my group. If you're a part of my Facebook group, I just recently posted about this. You really want to leave some white space in your painting to emphasize different highlights and shadows within your painting. It means just leaving the white space underneath of your paint, like this paper comes through that. So for example, if I'm creating some sort of foliage, like trees and bushes in the background, what I'll normally do is again pick up some paint. Let's just choose green because I'm talking about bushes here. And I'm just going to kind of move around the paper and just leaving that white space in between because that kind of acts like a highlight. So maybe there's light hitting the bushes, just kind of, because really honestly there's, a bush isn't going to have just look like one big blob. It's going to have some spatial composition. You want to leave those highlights. So that's kind of what negative painting is, just focusing on the shapes, letting that white pull through. And then we also have scumbling, which is kind of similar. Again, I use this for doing foliage. So basically I'll pick up some of my paint, move again all around the paper. No rhyme or reason really, just moving right along. So I've got my light color there, but now I'm going to go in with maybe some blue to add some shadowing. So you can see how they blend together, but I'm getting a nice shadow effect. So I have my highlight, I have my shadow with the blue, and I can just keep going in and adding darker color with my blue. And those colors are going to blend together. It gives a nice effect there. Wipeout is when we use either a piece of paper towel or Kleenex to wipe up some of the paint. Again, maybe we made a mistake or we're trying to make some clouds, kind of lift up some of the color. So for example, I'm going to go into my blue here. Okay, and I'm just going to make some color on my paper, or apply some color to my paper, and keep applying so you get the consistency that you want. You do have to do this while it is the paint is wet. Otherwise, you're going to have a really hard time using paper towel or Kleenex to wipe anything up. So what you do is just take your Kleenex or your paper towel, and you can either blot like that so it lifts up some of the paint. You can scrape it. The only concern I have about scraping, if you do it repetitively over time, just keep going over the same spot, what you're going to end up doing is basically rubbing the paper fibers, and they're going to come apart, and you're going to have a really nasty area on your paper where the if you go back over it, the paint's just going to pull in that one area. So for example, just to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, let's see. I'm just going to make this darker. I'm going to scrub rigorously with this, and it's just going to tear up those paper fibers. So now I've really made a nasty mess of my paper, and if I paint over top of this, it's just all gonna pull in that area. See, I can't get it to move around. It's just kind of stuck there. So now I'm stuck with this dark area because I've made an indent in my paper. So that's what you don't want to do when you are painting. All right, the next thing is called a hard and soft edge. So really, we kind of already did this with the graded wash. As you can see, some of these steps are kind of repetitive. But really what a hard edge is just picking up your paint with your paintbrush. Okay, so I'm using less water, so it's gonna come out less translucent. It's gonna be more opaque. So this is kind of a hard edge. So I've got my dark color there. And then I'll just pick up some water and just set that aside to the right of my hard edge. And now I have a softer edge on my right hand side. The water just gives it that nice softer effect. Okay. Then we have glazing, which does take some time. You do have to let it dry and then go back over it. So for example, and this dries pretty quickly, so I'm just gonna put some color down. So usually we want to go with lighter. So I'm just going to let that dry. And basically I can kind of show this to you with using the wash as well. So I think I used red for that. So to go back in and show you what glazing is just, it basically means layering. So I'm going to go back in with another layer of red. Okay. So it's just making that area darker, and I can still see some of my nice soft edges with the lighter color underneath. So you're just constantly layering over top of that. But again, you do want it to be dry, and you can kind of keep going over and over and over and over to create a darker color. You can also add different colors. So like for example, I used this color first. I can go back with red and just glaze over top of that, and it'll give you a different shade. So that is glazing. You're just layering the paint over top of each other using the same color or using a different color on top of it.